Question number 11, the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Trade. What steps, if any, has his government taken to renegotiate the provisions in the South Korean FTA to ensure New Zealand can ban overseas buyers of our homes since he received the Select Committee report on the South Korean FTA recommending this be clarified, noting, as the Select Committee report did, that the Australian FTA with South Korea does allow Australia to ban overseas buyers of Australian homes?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr Speaker, we've taken no steps to renegotiate a trade agreement that we think confers substantial net benefits on New Zealand, particularly not to implement a policy of outright banning of sales of homes with which we do not agree.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
I seek leave to table the page from the South Korean Australian Free Trade Agreement where Australia is reserved the right to adopt or maintain any such ban.
Leave us sought to table that particular page of the Australian Korea FTA. Is there any objection? There is none. It can be tabled.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Why was the right of the government to ban foreign buyers of New Zealand homes given away in the South Korean Free Trade Agreement when the Australians have that right under their FTA with South Korea?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr Speaker, it was not a question of giving anything away. It was a question of not wishing to implement a policy we don't think is central to New Zealand's interests. And it is a policy stance which has informed a series of FTAs which has commanded wide support over the years from the Labour Party.
That's not correct.
Order.
Point of order. Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Under the free trade agreement with South Korea, has South Korea reserved for itself the right to adopt a ban on New Zealand people, not being corporates, buying South Korean residential land or homes?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr Speaker, I'd have to seek advice on that.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point order. Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, this is a question on notice.
No, order. Order. It wasn't. It was a supplementary question. The question on notice was answered. Order. If the member has further supplementaries, he's entitled to ask them. If it's a matter of whether the minister should have had a more answer acceptable to the minister, that's not a point. Order. That's not a point of order. That's creating disorder. Has the member got further supplementaries?
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Is the minister so incompetent that he does not know?
Order. That question is out of order. Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, it's not unreasonable for the opposition to expect the minister responsible for the free trade agreement that's given away the right for New Zealand.
The member's going very close to being asked to leave. He's creating disorder in this House. Question number 2. Okay, supplementary question, the Honourable David Parker.
Does the minister believe a competent minister of trade would know whether the South Koreans have reserved for themselves the right to ban New Zealand real people purchases of residential land?
The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr Speaker, I think a competent New Zealand Trade Minister would be focusing on New Zealand real interests instead of phony solutions to Labour's problems with the Auckland housing market.
Order, Mr Speaker.
Order. Point of order, the Honourable David Parker.
Mr Speaker, I have a number of overdue questions of the Minister of Trade that I have...
Order. I will look into, if there's a matter of late written questions, I will look into the matter, as I said I would for another member earlier. I will be annoyed if there hasn't been some communication between the member and the Minister's office, and certainly equally be annoyed if the delay is a matter of a day or so, but I will look into the matter.
Sir?
No, I don't need further assistance. I said I'd look into
Well, I will provide the email trails.
Member is going very close to being asked to leave the chamber. Question number 12, Scott Simpson.